over the spectrums of storytelling. Now, this is going to be a two-parter. I'm going to post both of them today, but it's going to be in two parts. The reason for this is because there's a lot to go over. The first part I wanted to go over is audience. And the reason I want to go over audience is because we're going to have to determine what type of audience we're writing for. And knowing what type of audience we're writing for takes a little bit of work. As you can see, I have a pretty strange diagram. So let's break this down. In the middle, you will see I have something that says general audience. And you can see all these different other things. Comedy, emotion, fear, logic, education, eccentric, theatrics, romance. All these elements enter into the general audience. People don't tend to like too much of one thing. However, there is a safe spot called the general audience. But as you can see, I have children on one side and adult on the other. Children will go towards the eccentric and the education. Or parents will make them go towards the education. That is a safe area writing for children. However, children aren't that interested in romance, and no way in hell should you let a kid get into horror. I mean, you would scare the shit out of them. You can see that there's these dynamics, and what I'm setting up is a list of dynamics that are polar opposites. Children's fiction is different than adults. Now, there are outliers, but generally speaking, they're on the opposite spectrum. Same thing with theatrics and realism. Theatrics is more or less, it's fake. It's not real. And I'm not talking about fantasy versus reality. I'm talking about, like, in a situation. Like cartoons, for instance. There's cartoon logic. You know, you fold something and it becomes something else. Or, like, you get punched in the face in, let's say, a comic book. You know, obviously, superheroes, there's some level of fantasy, because in realism, if you get punched like that, your bones would break. You know, that goes more towards realism. So theatrics and realism are opposites, and which we'll go into these more in detail later on, maybe. I might make a separate series covering all these on their own, but we're just going over this in general today. The next one I want to point out are the corners of the diamond in the middle. You will see comedy is on one side, emotion is on the other. I put them on the same row for a reason. It's because comedy is emotion, but at the same time, they're not the same thing. Comedy can be brought out by a number of different things, but comedy is lighthearted, whereas emotion tends to be on the negative. Emotion comes out normally when there's something negative that brings out that emotion. Whereas comedy, it's something positive bringing out that laughter. And the same thing at the bottom. You will see that fear and logic are on the same line. Well, that's because logic doesn't have fear, because logic beats fear. Whereas fear is the absence of knowledge. Fear comes from ignorance. So obviously logic is the superior standing there. Now, I'm not saying all situations, I'm just saying with writing. When somebody knows everything that's going on, there's little fear for them to have. However, if they don't have the information, that is where you get into the fear spectrum. It creates tension. So if you're going towards something that's going to create tension, you definitely want to control that element of fear. So the next one you'll see, the next rim you'll see, is that emotion and fear are parallel. They're, vertical to each other. That's because fear and emotion, once again, they're not the same thing. Fear is the negative, so it draws south. Whereas emotion is the positive in this. It draws north, in which it leads to a different type of feeling. Fear is not necessarily the type of emotion that we want. We don't want to have fear. Fear is bad to us, right? It gives us a thrill, though. It really drives us. So the emotion spectrum has a different goal in mind, and the fear, when you drive that to its maximum, has a different goal. So then we'll go right over to comedy and logic. Logic, obviously, is not very funny. It's kind of boring, to be honest, sometimes. Now, I find that stuff fascinating, but most people in the general will find too much logic to be boring. So comedy is, once again, in that same type of spectrum label. I have the silly spectrum, the drama spectrum, the dark spectrum, and the reason spectrum. The silly spectrum is more or less cartoony, what you'd generally expect from classic cartoons. It's just silly. Or like for children's books, it's just silly. It doesn't have any real end goal other than to make you smile. The drama spectrum is also on the adult side, because adults tend to be more into the deeper emotional connections that they have with the book. A child doesn't necessarily care about the deeper emotional connection. They want instant satisfaction, So that comes from the silly spectrum. They want to laugh, they want to smile, they want to have fun. Now, the bottom ones, the dark spectrum, it's in fear and realism that the dark spectrum really begins to shine. And that's because fear comes from not knowing something. And so when you add realism to that, it is the threat that drives the fear. Because in realism, there's a threat. In theatrics, there's no threat. So the threat drives the fear. Realism, logic, leads to education. I put that on the children's scale because children normally should be able to be educated, and it's no big deal. Now, granted, there are subjects that children would find scary, I think, because they don't have enough knowledge. But anyone that has superior education will be out of the fear spectrum with education. Now, granted, there are things that I can read that will scare me, the threat of something, but that's because it's not knowing if it'll happen. Once again, that draws us back into the fear spectrum. It's the not knowing. It's not the knowing. If you know what's going to happen, you're not afraid of it. But if you don't know what's going to happen, like the threat of you're getting your head chopped off by some random person, that can be the part that drives the fear. It's the unknown. So the next ones to look at is the very far, far, far corners. You have eccentric, romance, horror, and education. I want to cover eccentric first. The eccentric is something I made up because I couldn't think of a word otherwise. I wanted to put gag or routine, but I really didn't think that covered it. What I mean by eccentric, I mean that it has no further drive other than just to make you laugh. It is the theatrics on overdrive. Theatrics doesn't normally have deeper meaning to it. It does, and it can, but it's more or less on the level that it's light. It's very light. It's lighthearted. It doesn't want to drive you to think. Just for laughs. I'll use just for laughs. It's like that festival. Now, education, as you can see down below, it drives from the realism. So we'll go over to horror now. Now, as you can see, horror is in the darkest spectrum you can get to. That is the overdrive of fear. That is when you take fear to its maximum. So you need to go towards the realism and the adult. Horror is not meant for children, and it is driven by fear. So now we go over to the emotion, and if you put the emotion in overdrive, you get to romance and adult. Now, if you were to put the adult to overdrive, I'm sure you'd get to other things that we won't talk about here, that probably YouTube wouldn't even allow me to talk about. The adult spectrum is different than the children's, and your goal as a writer is to decide what spectrum, where your audience is going to be. Now, as you can see, I have an outline around that general audience. In the middle of that general audience, if you stay in there, you're safe. Now, when you get into that outline, you're starting to lose your general audience. If you start going into these areas too far, you're going to lose your general audience. It's just naturally going to happen. Once you go beyond that little square, the last little outlining, you're into something called the niche. And once you reach the niche means it's outside of the general. And when you experiment with the niche, you're going to find that your audience is selective. It's going to be a much smaller audience. Now, market-wise, there are two strategies. One is to attract the general audience, and since so many people might be into it, you'll sell a ton of copies because it's inevitable. There's so many people looking at it. However, there is also a new market strategy coming out, and that is the niche. It used to be not good to have niche fiction because it only attracted a few people. But since mass marketing has come out, that few people are more dedicated, so you can end up selling more copies in the niche if you know how to market yourself. So this is just what I have to do first. Now, the next part, we're going to be going over genre, subgenre. We'll go over a little bit of subgenre. And we'll go over some of the other nuances of this subject. And then we'll find our audience. We have to find our audience before we start writing, because we want to keep that in mind. I hope this has explained this diagram for you well enough. I'm going to post it on my DeviantArt, and hopefully you guys will check it out. I might even post it on my Pinterest. I hope you guys enjoyed this and you got something out of it. On to the next video.